Try to imagine a disease with a fatality rate so close to 100% that survival isn't really a category, just a small handful of medically documented exceptions out of dozens of attempts to replicate them, none of which have reliably worked twice. Now imagine finding out you'd already been exposed weeks ago, quietly, with no symptoms at all to warn you, and there was nothing anyone could have done. That disease is real, and it's more common than most people assume. It's called rabies, and once it reaches a certain point in your body, modern medicine, all of it, every advance of the last century is essentially powerless to stop it. Not because doctors haven't tried, because of how the virus itself works, in a way that makes it almost uniquely suited to evading everything the human immune system and modern pharmacology know how to do. The virus responsible belongs to a group called lysoviruses, named after Lyssa, the Greek spirit of mad rage and frenzy, an oddly fitting name chosen well before anyone understood what the disease actually did inside the body. Under a microscope, it has a distinctive bullet-like shape, and it's carried by an unusually wide range of warm-blooded animal hosts. Depending on where in the world you are, dogs remain the dominant source of human infections globally, responsible for the vast majority of cases, while in parts of North America and Europe, bats, raccoons, skunks, and foxes serve as the primary wild reservoirs. Almost any mammal can theoretically carry and transmit it. That breadth is part of what makes the disease so persistent. There isn't one animal population you could realistically eliminate to make the threat disappear. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Rabies doesn't announce itself right away. After a bite from an infected animal, the virus doesn't rush into your bloodstream where your immune system might catch it early. It does something quieter and honestly smarter. It travels along the peripheral nerves, the same wiring that carries sensation and movement signals throughout your body, moving slowly, inch by inch, toward your spinal cord and eventually your brain. This process can take anywhere from a few days to, in rare documented cases, over a year, depending on how far the bite site is from the head. For all of that time, you can feel completely fine. No fever, no pain, nothing. The virus is simply traveling, hidden inside your own nervous system, in the one place your immune system has the hardest time reaching it. By the time symptoms actually appear, the virus has usually already reached the brain, and that's the point past which treatment essentially stops working. The symptoms themselves are specific in a way that's hard to forget once you know them. Anxiety and agitation, muscle spasms, and in the form most people associate with the disease, an intense, painful spasming of the throat triggered by the mere sight or thought of water. A symptom so characteristic that rabies has historically been called hydrophobia, literally fear of water. It isn't fear in the psychological sense. It's the body's own swallowing muscles going into violent, involuntary spasm at the attempt. There are actually two distinct clinical forms the disease can take, and they don't look alike at all, which surprises most people who assume rabies has just one recognizable presentation. What most people picture aggression, agitation, that characteristic fear of water, is called furious rabies, and it accounts for roughly 80% of human cases. But in the remaining share, the disease instead produces paralytic or dumb rabies, a quieter, slower progression of weakness and paralysis spreading upward from the bite site, with far less of the aggression or hydrophobia most people associate with the illness, while the patient often stays lucid, calm, and fully aware the entire time. Paralytic rabies is arguably the more disturbing of the two. In one specific way, it's frequently mistaken for other conditions entirely, like Guillain-Barré syndrome, which means it sometimes goes undiagnosed until it's far too late, precisely because it doesn't look anything like the movie version of the disease. For nearly all of recorded human history, a rabies diagnosis after symptoms began was simply a death sentence, full stop. There was no negotiating with it, no supportive care that meaningfully changed the outcome, nothing to do but wait. Some historians have speculated that the disease's specific symptoms, aggression, foaming at the mouth, an altered, almost animalistic mental state in its final stages, may have fed directly into old folklore about werewolves and demonic possession in regions where rabid animal bites were common. That connection isn't settled history, but it's a striking coincidence given how the disease actually presents. This isn't a disease humanity only recently noticed, either. The earliest probable written reference to it appears in the Code of Eshnunna, a Mesopotamian legal text dating back roughly 4,000 years, which specifically fined dog owners if their animal bit someone and that person later died, an early acknowledgement that whatever this was, it was predictable, transmissible, and almost always fatal. Aristotle described the same madness in dogs centuries later. And the Roman physician Celsus, writing in the 1st century AD, gave a detailed clinical account and recommended cauterizing bite wounds with a hot iron, a brutal treatment, but one that, by pure accident, may have actually destroyed some of the virus at the wound site before it could travel any further. For roughly 4,000 years, in other words, humans knew exactly what this disease looked like and exactly how it killed you. They just had no way to stop it once it started. The first real crack in that death sentence came in 1885, and it's one of the more famous moments in the history of medicine. A 9-year-old boy named Joseph Meister was mauled by a rabid dog in Alsace, France, bitten 14 times. His mother brought him to Louis Pasteur, who had been developing an experimental rabies vaccine tested only on animals, never on a human being. Pasteur hesitated the treatment was completely unproven in people, but ultimately agreed and administered a series of increasingly potent injections over 10 days. Meister never developed rabies. It's worth being precise about what actually happened here, though, because it matters. Meister was treated after exposure, but before symptoms appeared. Pasteur hadn't cured rabies. He had figured out how to win a race against it, using the same slow nerve-by-nerve travel time that makes the disease so insidious to instead buy the immune system enough time to build defenses first. That distinction, prevention before symptoms versus treatment after, is still the entire foundation of how rabies is managed today. Once symptoms start, you have essentially missed the window Pasteur discovered. Diagnosing rabies with certainty, though, remained surprisingly difficult for another 2 decades after Pasteur's breakthrough. That changed in 1903, when an Italian pathologist named Adelchi Negri, working in Camillo Golgi's laboratory in Pavia, discovered small, sharply defined structures inside the brain cells of rabid animals, tiny inclusions visible under a microscope, later named Negri bodies in his honor. Negri believed, incorrectly, that he'd found the actual parasite causing the disease within the same year. Other researchers proved rabies was instead caused by a virus, far too small to see with the microscopes of that era. But Negri's mistaken theory didn't undermine his discovery's usefulness. For decades afterward, right up until modern immunofluorescence and electron microscopy techniques took over, finding Negri bodies in brain tissue remained the standard. Most reliable way to confirm a rabies diagnosis after death, a diagnostic tool built on an incorrect theory that nonetheless worked. And that window is still the whole story, well over a century later. The World Health Organization estimates that rabies kills roughly 59,000 people globally every year, the overwhelming majority in Asia and Africa, and the overwhelming majority from dog bites. Often in places where post-exposure vaccination isn't quickly accessible. This isn't some extinct historical horror. It's an ongoing, largely preventable disease that continues to kill tens of thousands of people annually, almost entirely because of a gap in access to a treatment that has existed since 1885. The tools to end this disease as a human killer already exist. What's missing, in most of the places it still kills people, isn't science. It's distribution, which brings us back to that fatality rate and the tiny handful of genuine exceptions that make it almost, but not quite, absolute. In 2004, a 15-year-old girl named Jeanna Giese was bitten by a bat, developed full symptomatic rabies weeks later, and remarkably survived, without ever having received the vaccine. Her doctors, led by Rodney Willoughby, used an experimental approach that came to be called the Milwaukee Protocol, inducing a medical coma to suppress brain activity, essentially trying to protect her neurons from the damage the virus causes long enough for her own immune system to catch up and fight it off. It worked. She recovered, with some lasting effects, and eventually made a college graduation and a family of her own. Here's the uncomfortable footnote to that story, though, because it genuinely matters for understanding just how frightening this disease really is. The Milwaukee Protocol has since been attempted on dozens of other symptomatic rabies patients around the world, and the overwhelming majority of those attempts have failed. Giese's case remains one of only a handful of confirmed survivals of symptomatic rabies without prior vaccination, and doctors still don't fully agree on why it worked for her and not for almost everyone else who has tried the same protocol since. It isn't a cure. It's closer to a single, imperfectly understood miracle that researchers have not been able to reliably reproduce more than 20 years later. So what actually makes rabies the most terrifying disease in recorded history? More than the Black Death, more than smallpox, more than any of the plagues that tend to get more attention in popular retellings. It isn't the death toll plenty of historical diseases have killed vastly more people. It's the specific, almost engineered feeling cruelty of the mechanism. A virus that hides from your immune system by traveling silently through your own nerves, that gives you no symptoms at all during the only window when it could still be stopped. And that becomes essentially unstoppable by the time you'd have any reason to suspect something was wrong. You could be infected right now, feel completely normal, and have weeks before you'd ever know. That's not a disease that overwhelms you quickly, the way plagues and outbreaks tend to in popular imagination. It's a disease that waits, quietly, inside the very system your body uses to sense danger in the first place, and by the time it lets you know it's there, in almost every documented case in human history, it's already too late to do anything about it. That waiting period is also the reason rabies occupies such a strange psychological space compared to other diseases on this list. A plague or an outbreak announces itself fever, visible symptoms, an obvious before and after. Rabies, for weeks or sometimes months, gives you nothing to react to at all. There's no moment of clear diagnosis to rally around, no obvious point where the danger became real. Just an ordinary feeling stretch of time that for a small, unlucky number of people every year turns out to have already been the only window that mattered. If it's any comfort, the fix for rabies, unlike almost every other disease on this list, isn't a mystery. It isn't waiting on some future breakthrough. It's the same fix Pasteur discovered in 1885: get treated before symptoms start. Every single time, no exceptions. In 2015, the World Health Organization, alongside veterinary and agricultural partners worldwide, launched a coordinated global campaign with a specific, deliberately ambitious name, 0 by 30, the goal of eliminating human deaths from dog-mediated rabies entirely by the year 2030, mainly through mass dog vaccination and wider access to post-exposure treatment. It's already worked in large parts of the world. Dog-mediated rabies has been essentially eliminated from Western Europe, Canada, the United States, and Japan. The terrifying part was never the lack of a solution. It was always just a matter of who gets access to it in time. Would you want to know if you'd been exposed to something like this, even if there was nothing anyone could do about it yet? Or would you rather not know until there was actually something to be done? Let me know what you think in the comments. See you in the next one.